Justice Hunters is right around the corner for us here in the TCG, and I want to make a brief video on how the primary decks in Justice Hunters format, Dragontail, Yummy, and Canine, will translate into the TCG. Everyone knows that Vanquish Soul Canine is going to be the best deck, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that, but I do think there is one other deck that will give it a serious run for its money, and then there are a bunch of other decks that I think will not perform nearly as well here in the TCG. So as a point of reference, I will talk about the very early OCG metagame, and then I'll talk about the current state of the OCG and what will translate or not into the TCG. By the way, if there are any OCG players who are watching this video, please let me know your thoughts in comments below, because I know that us TCG players don't actually understand the OCG very well, and we're kind of speculating. Okay, so to start with, in the very first metagame breakdown here in the OCG for Justice Hunters format, we saw that Malice was the most represented deck by a very slim margin. Now, right off the bat, before we talk about anything else, I do not think this is going to be the case in the TCG, and if we see Malice represented highly initially in the early events, I think it'll probably just be because people are on the old stuff. Malice is a lot more affordable now, and maybe the Justice Hunters decks are going to be pretty expensive, and so some players will just want to play Malice instead. But for those of you who played Malice when Link Decoder was alive, this card was debatably the strongest card in the entire deck. It is what allowed Malice before Alliance Insight to play around basically any hand trap in the game. And if we had this card right now in the TCG, this deck would be far more oppressive than it currently is, even though there are very strong silver bullets. So even if Malice is not touched by the ban list in the TCG, I don't think Malice will do nearly as well because they do not have Link Decoder. It's just like a free body in an archetype that really cares about free bodies. One free body can be the difference between an extra boss monster and nothing, or playing through another 2 interactions versus playing through nothing else. So yeah, I don't think Malice will do nearly as well, but maybe people will hold on to it in the initial metagame. Briefly, I just want to say there is kind of a comparison you can make between Dragontail and Malice in the sense that Dragontail went through a bunch of different iterations in the OCG, like playing a King of the Swamp build, which I think is kind of cheesy because to make a turn 0 play with King of the Swamp, you have to have drawn 5 mana and also King of the Swamp and also another fusion material just to go into something like a turn 0 Dragoon, which I don't know if that's really worth building your deck around. But then it turns out that people were just going to play stuff like Retaliating Sea, and so if you were putting more cards into your deck like King of the Swamp that were searching for magic fusion spells, you were just going to play really hard into your silver bullet. And so Dragontail had to adapt itself somewhat in the later OCG metagame, and I think that if your engine is somewhat constrained by having to adapt to the non-engine in the current meta, it means that maybe you can't play at your full potential. Now, Dragontail is obviously a very strong deck that can adapt, and so I think it will be a very good deck and a strong contender, but I do not think it will be one of the best decks. Now, if we move over, let's not talk about Yummy yet. So let's go to the almost the current OCG metagame. We've seen that Vanquish Soul Canine is obviously the best deck. And in the TCG, I think it will clearly also be the best deck. But I think that there are some differences between Vanquish Soul Canine, what we'll see here in the TCG, and what we have experienced recently with the current best TCG decks. So for example, if you think back to Ryzeal is a deck where even though there was skill expression, the floor was so high that a poor player could still easily beat a good player just because they had, for example, a detonator on board that the better player didn't draw the out to, and then that detonator could solo certain archetypes like Malice or White Forest in many cases. But I think Vanquish Soul is a little bit more intense on the skill requirement side, and even though the engine is so overtuned and strong and power crept that you probably will be able to get away as a worse player beating better players on worse decks, I don't think you'll be able to replicate that if they're on other Justice Hunters decks. The Justice Hunters decks are power crept enough in terms of their engine that I do think that they can still beat Vanquish Soul players, but a really good Vanquish Soul Canine player is going to be basically undefeatable. So that's my general thoughts on Vanquish Soul Canine. Yummy, however, I think is the sole shining light in the darkness that will be able to beat the Vanquish Soul Canine decks pretty consistently. And I think that this is maybe it won't be the best deck. Maybe Vanquish Soul Canine will have a substantial representation edge over this, but I do think that the difference is not actually that great, and I think Yummy is an extraordinary deck for many different reasons. First of all, the engine in Yummy, despite being small right now, just 9 cards in the main deck names, you know, the Cupsy, the Cookie, and the Lollipop, these cards are so good at pushing into boards, and their extra deck monsters like the Link 1 and the Synchros are so good at being reactive and putting board presence on field that you can't just get oppressed by a slightly stronger deck like Vanquish Soul. You're going to have a lot of responses to almost everything your opponent does. In addition to that, one of the major strengths that this deck has that almost no other deck in the Justice Hunters meta is going to have is the flexibility of engine and non-engine you can mix with this deck. You don't have to play, for example, Songs of the Dominator like I was showing in my introduction to Yummy, and Purge, or even Obedient Schooled, as exceptional as Obedient Schooled is. You could play a heavy Fiendsmith package, you could play a Canine package if you really wanted to, I guess. There are lots of different things you could throw into this deck and it will just work because the Yummy engine is so small and compressed and efficient that you can argue for lots of other types of things. You could even play like 3 Engage, Hornet Drones, a larger Sky Striker package, and it still would work because the deck is so flexible and adaptable. So I think that this may be a kind of a sleeper pick in the TCG, not because people don't think it's going to be one of the best decks, but because I think people may be underestimating how flexible and adaptable this is to whatever the TCG metagame turns out to be. So this is the deck that is #1 on my radar in terms of potential, and it's probably what I want to put the most time into. If we look at the absolute most recent stuff, or the most recent overview in the OCG, we still see that Vanquish Soul is the best deck and Yummy is the second best deck, and then everything else is just kind of fighting for its spot after that. I do think that we are going to see something similar in the TCG where decks like Lunalight, despite being worse decks, will still have oppressive enough end boards with stuff like a Towers, a Baguska, and a Little Knight that you just can't out the board without very specific types of non-engine in many cases, even if you're on a really good deck. And so I think those types of decks like Lunalight and White Forest will be able to sneak wins consistently, but they will never be very well represented because they're just objectively worse in terms of their push into hand traps or into existing boards. Canine Crystron, I do think has a huge amount of potential in the TCG. Depending on how expensive Izuna is, that may end up being one of the more budget-friendly decks. But Izuna probably is going to be one of the money cards, and then if anything, the other Vanquish Soul, the other Canine cards like Lantern, and the ones that are less likely to be splashed are probably going to be the cheaper cards. So yeah, but anyhow, my final kind of thoughts on this right now, or predictions and expectations, are I think that decks like Dragontail are going to be great decks. They will require good pilots because it's a very resource efficient, intense type of deck where if you don't know how to loop through your resources correctly, you're just going to lose very, very quickly. I think that decks like Yummy and Vanquish Soul will be carried somewhat by their level of power creep, but the skill expression in mirrors and then between Vanquish Soul, Canine, and Yummy I think is going to be quite strong. And I think also decks like Malice are going to have a very, very hard time with certain types of interactions that didn't really exist before Justice Hunters. Like, for example, the Holly Sue being able to steal a normal summoned Malice card like a Dormouse, and then they don't have access to that card in their graveyard to extend with like a Bestial or turning it into something else if you negate the effects. So being able to steal that body is a very specific type of interaction that Malice is not used to having to deal with. And so I think that Malice is definitely going to struggle more here in the TCG, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how Yummy does in the upcoming format. So those are my initial super brief thoughts right now, and as soon as the ban list comes out, I'll do much more in-depth stuff. I'll be following up on my intro series with more advanced content. So if you're interested in that, feel free to subscribe. If you're not, then don't. Thanks for watching.